The noise around a presidency is hard to imagine until it's gone. For years, Barack Obama lived inside that noise. Phones ringing, rooms full of people waiting for answers. Then, one day, it ended. No motorcade outside the window. No late-night briefings. Just a quiet porch. An old coffee mug resting on the table. Dry leaves sliding across the wooden floorboards. After leaving the White House, Obama began speaking to groups of young people, not as a president, just as someone who had spent enough years watching how people behave when power, pressure, and time begin to shape them. He didn't offer grand advice, just a few observations about life, and most of them were things people usually understand much later than they expect. Most of us spend our lives climbing. We believe that once we reach a certain height, the wind will calm down. That success will somehow quiet the uncertainty. It rarely works that way. The view from the top can feel lonelier than the climb itself. After leaving the White House, Barack Obama began meeting with groups of young people, students, young organizers, future leaders who still believed the road ahead would make perfect sense. He didn't spend much time talking about policy. Most of the conversations drifted somewhere quieter, toward people, toward time, toward the strange ways life changes what we think we know. Picture a highway late at night, 2 in the morning, headlights cutting through the dark, no traffic, just miles of road and the low sound of the engine. There's a certain clarity that arrives in moments like that. You realize the road keeps going whether you rush or not. When we're younger, we think the world is something we can manage if we work hard enough. Work longer hours, send the email, make the call, win the argument. It feels like control, but time has a quiet way of softening that belief. Things that once felt urgent begin to shrink. The late-night messages, the bruised pride after a meeting, the need to prove a point. 10 years later, many of those moments look smaller than they once did, like shadows in a room you no longer live in. Obama saw something similar during his years in the West Wing. People moved quickly through those halls. Phones ringing, staffers rushing from one office to another, voices rising during tense conversations. Everyone believed their role was essential. And sometimes it was. But there was also another pattern. Many people confused busyness with importance. They thought the loudest voice in the room carried the most weight. They thought leadership meant filling every silence with words. Over time, Obama began noticing something different. The strongest people in those rooms were often the quietest ones. They listened. They watched. And when the room finally went still, they spoke with fewer words than anyone expected. Most young people don't see that right away. In your 20s and 30s, the instinct is to push harder, speak louder, move faster. It feels like momentum, but life has a way of slowing things down. And when it does, certain questions begin to surface. Questions that don't show up in busy rooms. Questions that arrive later. Who are you when the noise fades? Who are you when the meeting ends and the hallway is empty? And perhaps the harder one, who are you when the motorcade finally stops? That question sounds simple at first. Who are you when the motorcade finally stops? But for a lot of people, the silence that follows isn't peaceful. It feels like punishment. Think about an empty room after a party. Half-finished glasses on the table, dim light in the corner, a chair pushed back and left that way. Then the door closes, and all at once the quiet feels louder than the music did. During his years in the White House, Obama saw how easily people could become attached to motion. Not just work, not just pressure, presence. The feeling of being needed, being watched, being the person everyone turns toward when something happens. That kind of attention can start to feel like oxygen. After a while, some people don't know who they are without it. That's where ego begins to do its quiet work. Not as arrogance, at least not always. Sometimes ego looks polished, disciplined, even responsible. But underneath, it's often just fear dressed in better clothes. Fear of being overlooked. Fear of becoming ordinary. Fear that if the room stops noticing you, something inside you might disappear too. People over 50 begin to notice this in a different way. Usually not in public. Usually in some small, unremarkable moment. A late afternoon in the kitchen, a parked car in the driveway, the house finally still, and there it is. The strange realization that ego was never a home. It was a wall. For years we build that wall carefully. We stack titles onto it. Achievements, reputation, the polished version of ourselves we want other people to believe. From the outside, it can look strong, maybe even necessary. And for a while, it helps. It shields us from embarrassment. It keeps old wounds covered. It gives us something solid to stand behind. But walls do two things. They protect, and they block the view. That's the harder part. Because after enough years, a person can forget there is anything behind the wall at all. They start mistaking the image for the self, the applause for the identity, the role for the person. Leaving the White House seems to have sharpened that truth for Obama. Power has a way of giving shape to every day. Schedules, security, meetings, decisions that carry weight. Then suddenly, much of that structure is gone. No room left to impress. No opponent to outmaneuver. No constant noise to drown out the quieter questions. Just the man himself. And whatever remained when the role stepped aside. That's when another truth becomes easier to see. Real control was never about controlling other people. It was about controlling the part of yourself that panics when the spotlight moves away. It's like driving through a snowstorm at night. You can't command the weather. You can't order the wind to stop. You can't make the road shorter just because you're tired. All you really have is your hands on the wheel and the steadiness of your breathing. A lot of young people enter adulthood gripping life that way, too tightly. They hold the wheel until their hands almost lock. They call it ambition. Sometimes it is, but sometimes it's just fear. Fear that if they loosen their grip, everything will come apart. Fear that silence means they are falling behind. Fear that if they stop proving themselves, they will stop mattering. But silence doesn't erase a person. It only strips away what was never fully theirs to begin with. The titles, the performance, the shallow applause. And once those things begin to fall away, something else comes into view. Something quieter. Something most people spend years avoiding. The possibility that freedom has less to do with becoming someone important and more to do with no longer needing to. Emotional bridge from part 3. The wall begins to crack, and what remains is quieter, simpler, and more honest. Once a person begins to see through the wall of ego, something subtle changes. Life stops looking like a competition. It starts looking more like a long road. Obama spent years in rooms where decisions carried enormous weight. People spoke carefully, every word measured. But outside those rooms, another pattern slowly revealed itself. Power doesn't necessarily make people wiser. Sometimes it simply makes their habits louder. Think about a small meeting room late in the evening. The table is covered with papers, coffee cups left half full. A few tired faces leaning back in their chairs. Everyone has an opinion. Everyone wants to be the one with the answer. Yet the person who often sees the clearest is the one who waits the longest before speaking. That's one of the quieter lessons Obama began repeating to younger audiences. You don't have to win every argument. When we're young, being right feels like survival. We sharpen our words. We collect facts. We push harder when someone disagrees. But time reveals something uncomfortable. Many arguments are not really about truth. They're about identity. Two people defending the version of themselves they've built over the years. Winning those battles rarely changes anyone. It only leaves the room heavier. A calm voice in a tense moment can do more than a clever argument ever will. Another observation came from watching the people around him. Even in the most powerful buildings in the world, uncertainty never disappears. Staff members walked those halls with confidence. They looked certain, prepared, in control. But if you stayed long enough, you noticed something beneath the surface. Most people are still figuring life out. The titles change. The offices grow larger. The responsibilities increase. Yet, the same quiet questions follow people everywhere. Am I doing the right thing? Did I choose the right path? Is this really the life I thought I was building? Young people often imagine that adulthood brings clarity. That one day the confusion simply stops. But experience shows something different. Clarity comes in small pieces, and it often arrives later than we hoped. Time also reveals another truth about people. You don't always need to judge them quickly. The years will do that work for you. Some friendships fade without drama. Some people surprise you with loyalty when everything becomes difficult. And some individuals who once seemed impressive slowly disappear from your life without leaving much behind. The road has a way of revealing character, not in dramatic moments, but in quiet ones. Who shows up? Who stays calm? Who chooses patience when anger would be easier? Success complicates this picture. From the outside, success looks like the solution to everything. Recognition, influence, opportunity. But anyone who spends enough time around powerful people eventually notices something strange. Success solves certain problems, but it does not solve loneliness. You can stand in a room filled with applause and still feel strangely disconnected from the people around you. Obama saw leaders surrounded by advisors, cameras, and constant attention. Yet the moments that seemed to matter most rarely happened in those crowded rooms. They happened in smaller places. A quiet conversation after a long meeting, a walk down a hallway when everyone else had already gone home, a short phone call with someone who knew them long before the titles appeared. Those were the moments when the performance ended, and the human being stepped forward again. That realization slowly rearranges a person's priorities, because the longer you live, the more you notice that the things people chase in their 20s and 30s don't always hold their value. The promotion, the reputation, the need to impress strangers. Over time, simpler things begin to feel heavy. A calm evening, a real conversation, a friend who stays when life becomes inconvenient. These things rarely look impressive from the outside, but they become the quiet center of a life that actually feels whole. That's why older people often speak more slowly when giving advice. They have seen how easily ambition can confuse movement with meaning. They have watched brilliant people exhaust themselves chasing approval, and they have learned that the strongest form of influence often appears in unexpected places, in restraint, in patience, in the ability to let a room settle before choosing your words. For young people, this lesson can feel almost backwards. Everything in the culture encourages speed, more effort, more visibility, more noise. But the people who last the longest on the road often develop a different rhythm. They learn when to step forward and when to step back. They learn that calm is not weakness, and that silence can sometimes carry more authority than a speech. Those observations were never delivered as grand declarations. They usually appeared in small moments: a conversation after a lecture, a question from a student, a short pause before answering. Because the deeper truths about life rarely arrive as dramatic revelations. They arrive slowly, almost quietly. The way evening light moves across a room. You don't notice the shift at first, but suddenly the shadows are longer, and the world feels different than it did a few hours before. The interesting thing about lessons like these is that most people don't recognize them while they're happening. Life rarely announces its turning points. There's no speech, no clear signal, just ordinary moments that feel almost forgettable at the time. A kitchen late at night, one light left on above the sink. The house quiet after everyone else has gone to bed. You sit there for a minute longer than usual, and suddenly, a thought arrives. Not a dramatic one, just a quiet realization. Many of the things that once felt urgent no longer seem that important. The argument you replayed in your head 10 years ago, the person you tried so hard to impress, the promotion that once felt like the defining moment of your life. Time rearranges their weight. What once felt enormous begins to shrink. What once seemed small begins to grow. Relationships are often where people notice this change first. When we're younger, friendships can revolve around proximity, school, work, shared routines. But over the years, life scatters people in different directions. Cities change, jobs shift, priorities evolve. Some friendships fade without explanation, not out of anger, just distance. Yet, a few people remain. Sometimes they are the ones who were quiet all along. The friend who calls once a year but means it. The person who shows up when things fall apart. Those connections begin to matter more than the dozens of acquaintances who once filled our calendars. Loneliness also takes on a different shape with time. When we're young, we fear being alone. Later, we begin to understand that solitude and loneliness are not the same thing. A quiet room can feel peaceful, but a crowded room without trust can feel empty. That's another realization many people reach later in life. Trust grows slowly, and it rarely appears in the places where people are trying the hardest to impress each other. It grows in smaller spaces. Conversations without an audience. Shared silence. Moments where no one is performing. That's why the simplest parts of life often become the most valuable. A slow Sunday morning. Coffee steaming on the table. Sunlight coming through the window. Nothing urgent waiting. No one asking you to prove anything. Just time. Enough time to breathe. Enough time to notice the people who are still sitting across from you. Ambition doesn't disappear as people grow older, but it changes shape. It becomes less about recognition, More about steadiness. Less about proving something. More about building something that lasts quietly. Young people often think the meaning of life is waiting somewhere far ahead. At the next milestone, the next achievement, the next door opening. But many people eventually discover something surprising. The meaning was never hidden in those distant places. It was sitting in the small moments all along. The conversation you almost rushed through. The walk you nearly skipped because you were too busy. The person you almost didn't listen to.
100.
Those moments rarely look important when they happen, but years later they are the ones
50,
people remember.
40,
And they are
30,
often the moments
20,
when the quiet observations someone once shared begin to make sense. Not all at once, just slowly, like a thought returning after a long time away. If you return to the image from the beginning, it becomes easier to understand. A quiet porch, an old coffee mug cooling in the evening air, the road stretching away beyond the trees. For years, Barack Obama lived inside a world where the noise never really stopped. Phones ringing, briefings beginning before sunrise, decisions that carried consequences far beyond the room. Every movement scheduled, every word observed. That kind of life has a rhythm of its own. Fast, relentless, full of voices. Then one day the rhythm changes. The motorcade is gone. The security detail fades into the background, and the calendar suddenly contains more empty space than before. For many people, moments like that can feel unsettling. When the noise disappears, something else becomes easier to hear. Your own thoughts. They arrive slowly at first, often during ordinary moments. Sitting outside in the evening, driving a quiet road, watching the last light settle across the floor of a room. Those are the moments when people begin to see their lives a little more clearly. Not through headlines, not through applause, just through time. That may be why the observations Obama shared with young people were never delivered like grand instructions. They sounded more like reflections someone might offer across a table. Simple, almost obvious, but carrying the weight of years behind them. Because life rarely changes through dramatic revelations. More often, it changes through small recognitions. The moment you realize you no longer need to win every argument. The moment you notice who stayed when things became difficult. The moment the silence in a room feels comfortable instead of threatening. These are the kinds of realizations that quietly reshape a life. They don't happen quickly, and they rarely arrive when we expect them. But eventually, most people find themselves sitting in a quieter place than the one where they began. A little older, a little slower, looking back down the road they once rushed along. And sometimes in that quiet moment, a person understands something that would have sounded impossible years earlier. That the most valuable part of life was never the noise. It was the calm that followed it. The space where a person no longer needs to prove who they are. Just the simple freedom of being there. On the porch, holding a cup of coffee that has already gone cold, watching the road stretch out ahead, and realizing that sooner or later every life reaches that quiet place. The real question is whether we recognize it when it arrives.
Stop it here? That's good. Come on around. All right.
NASA 557, contact tower 128.15. Maintain spacing interval 90 seconds. No closer than 3 nautical miles.
Approaching minimums. Minimums. 100. 50, 40, 30, 20, 10.